Now that we're in universal proxy, it seems like, well, it is the case that activists can target individual directors as opposed to just trying to go through, get a control slate or even a short slate that is primarily their folks. How do you go through that process of, I don't want to say culling the weak link directors, but I said it. So, identifying the vulnerabilities of the board and maybe having back pocket directors or other opportunities to protect you. Lynn?
Yeah, I think this is one of the hardest things to deal with. And the best practice is rarely followed, but, best practice would be that the chairman, if it's a combined CEO chairman, then the lead director lead a process every year of both the board evaluation, committee evaluation, and individual director evaluation. And that is done in a way in which allows for constructive feedback to directors about. I always like to say, what would we like to see you do more of? What would we like to see you do less of? What would we like you to continue, doing? Use a framework, use it on everybody, so you're not singling an individual out. And that if that's a healthy process, then that allows for follow-up discussion with directors that might be vulnerable. The other is having a succession plan, not only for the management, but you have to have a succession plan for directors. And that one, in my view, best practice would be actually to have term limits so that you have a natural trigger that helps you refresh your board. And if you do it right, you don't have everybody leaving at the same time, that you have a natural flow of a couple new directors with, a couple going off. Having said that, as a director and a NomGov chair, I would say the hardest thing is dealing with an underperforming director and how do you coach that director off the board. Now, interestingly enough, the vulnerability analysis, which looks at management and the board, can be your friend in this because there are certain things that they tend to go after. One is very long tenured directors. Now, in some cases, your long tenured directors are your best directors. Don't get me wrong, but that's not going to stop them from going after them. And the logic is you've been on this board forever and this company is still underperforming. So, you must not be, an effective director. Overboarding. Most companies are pretty good about making sure that you're following the rules on the public company, but you usually aren't reporting your private company boards. And sometimes your underperforming directors might be really heavy into private equity boards, portfolio, boards, and might have 16 or, whatever. That will be found out by the activists. I mean, they will know what you're doing. They also sometimes use private detectives to follow directors, and they will go after directors for bad behavior outside of the boardroom. If you know that you have some directors with bad behavior outside of the boardroom, that also becomes an area where it's delicate, but you can talk to them about because that's probably something they don't want to become public. And so, anyway, I'm sort of talking too much here, but
no, keep going. This is,
these are the areas that will get attacked. I guess the other attack area is. And this, maybe it's good that it's the woman is saying this. When there was such a push on diversity, I think there are certain cases where we put people on boards that maybe didn't have the experience. Great people, very smart, probably very good executives, but not at the same level, or maybe not, experience level, or experience with the industry level. And the activists will sometimes come after that. So, if you have a board that has almost nobody with industry experience, they'll start pecking at the people who are the furthest away from that experience. So if it's like an industrial company and the person's in consumer goods, that kind of thing. And I think having those conversations with directors who are likely to be targeted, particularly if they are people who are weaker on your board, those are the things that help them get over the edge of maybe I shouldn't stand for re-election next time.
One of the things that I found helpful as a CEO, and as I began to refresh our board, was to go to the more newly appointed board members after they'd got their sea leg, and I'd say, tell me what you think about our board. You've been to 2 or 3 or 4 board meetings. What do you think about it? And, sometimes you're too in the weeds to see who's not participating enough, or candidly, who's participating too much and playing CEO for a day once a quarter. We know those kind of board members, particularly if you're a CEO, those kind of board members. But just getting the opinion of the new person, saying, that's a perspective I hadn't seen before, and act on that. And I've been asked that as a board member and seen action on that.
Yeah. Lynn said a lot of very important things, but to unpack a little bit, and this is just as important for directors as is for the company itself, you have to be thoughtful about how you approach some of these processes. It is a terrible idea to give directors written reports about their performance, because those will come out. Maybe involve the general counsel's office or an outside lawyer so that it can be privileged if you're having bigger issues with your board. But, it only takes one email. You go back to the Sotheby's activist situation. The outgoing chair of the NomGov committee sent an email to the incoming chair of the NomGov committee listing the strengths and weaknesses of each director. When that director was called to the stand in the middle of a trial and was presented with that, it was pretty devastating. So, you have to be thoughtful about this. The other thing is, director succession is not something you do once a year. It's an ongoing process. People have life events. There are things that are going to happen. People change jobs. That should be constantly evaluated. If you've got good corporate governance guidelines, most large cap companies do. Many mid and small cap companies don't. But there's no harm in looking at some of those. But they have things like if a director changes a job, they have to, tender their resignation so the board can actually think about, does this person have time to continue to be constructive? Is it time for a change? The other reason you're thinking about director succession is you never know what's going to be around the next corner. And if an activist proposes somebody and for your board or suggests somebody for your board, you always want to have somebody in your back pocket that you're thinking about that could come on the board in a pinch. Because, if you're going to do a settlement with an activist, sometimes the activist has somebody in mind. Many times they don't. They just want change. But if you're willing to engage in settlement discussions, if you have somebody that's good, that's coming in from the outside, that's actually going to be much better for the company than letting the activists go out and pick who they think should be added to your board. And if you don't have anybody waiting in the wings, you don't have that opportunity. The last thing I would sort of say about this and evaluations is it doesn't help anybody to sugarcoat it. Sometimes it's the CEO that has to have the discussion. Sometimes it's the lead independent director. Sometimes it's the investment banker that's a friend of somebody or an outside lawyer. You have to think about how's the best way to get your message across. And there is no right answer every single time. No two boards are alike. We all come up with these guidelines and checklists and everything else. you need to make sure that they fit your company and fit your board. If you have a charter for your nom-gov committee that says you're going to do these 22 things, and somebody doesn't keep track to make sure that every year you do those 22 things, somebody is going to, in a fight, say, well, you said you did all this stuff. We requested books and records. And looking at the agendas of the last 4 nom-gov meetings, you didn't do any of these things. Last but not least is minutes. I hate drafting minutes, but it's my job. And it's an important thing for directors too. You want minutes that are sufficiently detailed so that they cover the items that were discussed at the meeting. They should not be a transcript. Nobody should be pushing record on the Zoom to get a live transcript of the meeting so they can prepare minutes. You'd be surprised what some people do to make their lives easier. Because that's a recording, that's a document. That's something that if you get a litigation hold, you have to preserve. It's important that minutes be done relatively soon after a meeting. Maybe there are a lot of meetings going on because there's an important corporate event. You want to make sure those minutes tell the story appropriately. One of the things that often happens in minute drafting is there may be a tax discussion that took 2 minutes and an M&A discussion that took an hour, but the tax guy writes the section of the minutes about what he or she talked about, and it's 3 pages, and the M&A discussion is a paragraph. That's not helpful for that. But that can come from the directors. Too often directors are silent about that, or they don't pay enough attention to minutes until they need to. Those minutes have to be sufficiently detailed so that you can refer to them in a litigation or in a proxy fight or anything else so that you remember. If they're too skinny and they don't even reference board presentations that were made or things like that, then you're going to be fighting an uphill battle to convince people that, in fact, you did talk about these issues or you did cover this. And so, we're in a category now where for minutes, it always what used to be less is more. That's not the case today. You want sufficient information in those minutes. That doesn't mean they have to go on for pages and pages, but they should be sufficient to cover what was discussed at the meeting. Please don't let your minutes say, Director X asked this question, Director Y asked that question, because it makes it look like anybody that's not in the minutes didn't ask any questions. And, again, it's to summarize the conversation. If there were outside advisors that were in the meeting, tell the minutes, tell when they were in and when they weren't in. If you say that you've got an investment banker that sat through your entire meeting, but frankly, he was only there for the first 10 minutes, well, a smart plaintiff's lawyer is going to argue that that discussion that you had with the board wasn't privileged if this investment banker was there the whole time. So these are little things, but one of the things you have to think about being as a director or general counsel or CEO is corporate hygiene. And these things are relatively low-hanging fruit, but especially in smaller or mid-cap companies that don't have the resources, these things often fall by the wayside, and it's incumbent for the board members to raise some of these issues.
I am so glad that you followed up my comments with "don't put it in writing." Okay. Even experienced directors in the heat of the battle write things down that they shouldn't write down. And so reminding board members of expected behavior around who talks externally and who talks internally, what gets written down and what doesn't get written down. And now in the age of ChatGPT, when to use it and when not, because every question you ask in that thing becomes discoverable. So that idea of the hygiene that David's talking about, it sounds simple and it sounds like, oh yeah, I've been on a board for 20 years, we know this. I can't tell you how many times people trip up on that. And so being really, really disciplined about keeping the disagreements, keeping the evaluations, keeping things verbal and civil.
The other thing I would tell you, and this is important in any boardroom, is making sure that during board meetings, people are focused on the board meeting. Some smart plaintiffs' lawyers have actually subpoenaed somebody's text messages to find out, oh, they were having a conversation with their child about their grade during the board meeting, or they sent 250 emails during the board meeting having nothing to do with the company. Or they are constantly, you got a very busy director who spends half the time outside the room working very hard, but there's a crisis in his or her company and they have to deal with it. You can be the smartest director in the world. If you're not in the room working when the board is meeting and working, you're hurting yourself as well as your fellow directors.